A judge blocking the deportations of Guatemalan migrant children while the kids were already on a plane. The order says the U.S. cannot remove them from the country without a deportation order. A Justice Department lawyer confirming the children would be taken off the plane and returned to government custody. DHS is expected to launch an immigration enforcement operation in Chicago later this week. Yesterday on CBS's Face the Nation, Secretary Kristi Noem said expanding this move to other cities is not off the table. She said, quote, we do intend to add more resources to those operations. All right, starting here this hour, Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker spoke with our Ed O'Keefe on Face the Nation, calling President Trump's deployment to cities a, quote, invasion with U.S. troops. He also claims the president is looking to do more than just crack down on crime in Chicago.
Well, they should understand that he has other aims other than fighting crime. The other aims are that he'd like to stop the elections in 2026 or, frankly, take control of those elections. He'll just claim that there's some problem with an election, and then he's got troops on the ground that can take control if, in fact, he's allowed to do this.
For more on this, let's bring in Jeanette Hoffman and Hyma Moore. Jeanette is a Republican strategist and president of Marathon Public Affairs. Hyma is a former director of the Office of the DNC chair and now a principal with Cornerstone Public Affairs. Thanks to both of you. And we will get to those comments from the governor of Illinois, but I want to start with this story about a judge blocking the deportation of more than 70 unaccompanied children from Guatemala. Jeanette, let's start with you first. Do you think this ruling may have the Trump administration sort of rethinking their approach to deportations, especially when it comes to minors?
Well, listen, there are a lot of concerns about due process in the immigration process, but I don't think this case particularly was one of them, specifically because they were reuniting these children with their relatives in Guatemala, and DHS was working with the Guatemalan government. This is, they had worked towards this effort here, and at least one of the children's, one relative had to request that one of these minor children be returned to Guatemala. So they were not actually being deported, they're being reunited with their relatives. So yes, I understand there are due process concerns with some of the immigration actions here by the administration, but I actually don't think this case was one of them. And I think it was a pretty outrageous action for the court, for the judge to basically, take these kids off the plane and stop the process here.
Hyma, I want to bring you in on this. Is your take that this was a reunification process, or was this about deportations? And what does this legal bloc really say about due process moving forward?
Hi, Cheryl. Good to see you, and happy Labor Day. Thanks for having me. Look, I think this says a couple of things. I think what we've seen over the past 7.5 months is the Trump administration try to stretch executive power as much as possible, and they've done this through the courts. We've known President Trump to be very litigious, and so I think this process it works in his benefit politically, and he is quite frankly wanting to go through this legal process. One, two, what it really shows is we don't think that the Trump administration, Secretary Noem, President Trump, have a real plan and vision to really carry out sort of this border security and this immigration process. And so while we're seeing a lot of fumbles throughout this process because there's no real plan. And so we do know that it's largely about deportations, it's largely about pleasing the base, it's largely about keeping a campaign promise to get as many people out of the country as possible. But there's not a lot of forethought and vision and process to this.
So I want to pivot to crime now. Jeanette, we heard from Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker just before we brought you both in, saying sending military troops to Chicago would be, quote, an invasion by the Trump administration. He's also, as you know, accusing President Trump of wanting to subvert the upcoming midterm election. So what's your reaction to that?
Well, first, there's a lot of rhetoric here that, subverting the midterm elections, there's no proof of that. What President Trump is telling Governor Pritzker to do is get Chicago under control. There were 53 people shot just this Labor Day weekend, 250 homicides in Chicago. Chicago has a real crime problem. President Trump is saying, get it under control or we will, like we did in D.C. In D.C., the mayor of D.C. has said what the Trump administration is doing has really helped. Carjackings were decreased by 85%. The results are there. The people of Chicago deserve to feel safe, whether they're in the south side of Chicago or any other area. Kids deserve to feel safe walking to school. So listen, I know there's a lot of rhetoric coming from Governor Pritzker. I know he may be considering running for president in 2028, and that's why he feels the need to say some of these outrageous things. But the bottom line, this is about protecting the people of Chicago, and that's what President Trump intends to do.
Hyma, what do you think this is about? Is this about crime or is this about something else?
Look, I think, and I've heard from a lot of Democrats. I've been in 3 states over the last 2 weeks, and a lot of Democrats and a lot of independents and even Republicans are really proud of the way the leadership that Governor Pritzker is showing right now. What I've seen and what I know is over the last 2 terms, Governor Pritzker has put more state police in Illinois, in Chicago than any governor before. And so I think he understands, and he's taken this crime issue very seriously. And crime has been a problem across the country, not just in blue cities and red cities as well, for a long time. And so I think if President Trump and his administration really thought about wanting to help the crime problem, they wouldn't have zeroed out the police budget in this last bill. They would put more money in. They would put cops. They put money in cops and community policing. They would put more money into local funding to help solving these problems around mental health, around drug use. And so I think the rhetoric is really on the Republican side. If the Republicans and Donald Trump and the House of Representatives and the Senate really cared about helping these cities deter crime, they would put a lot more investment in things that are going to deter crime, not just send the National Guard in at this moment for political ploy.
So when it comes to how this plan is already sort of playing out in other cities, we heard this weekend from Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Yesterday, she talked about ICE operations in Los Angeles on CBS's Face the Nation. Listen to part of that conversation.
I won't speak to the specifics of the operations that are planned in other cities, but I do know that LA wouldn't be standing today if President Trump hadn't taken action. Then that city would have burned down if left to the devices of the mayor and the governor of that state. And so the citizens who live there, the small business owners in downtown LA, they're thankful that President Trump came in with federal law enforcement officers and helped support keeping those streets open, keep their homes and businesses from burning down, and made sure the law and order was restored.
Jeanette, let's bring you in to talk about, okay, I see Hyma is up. So Hyma, let's go to you first. Is this an accurate read of the Trump administration's deployment to Los Angeles?
I don't think so, but here's the reality. Any mayor, any governor, Republican or Democrat, will welcome the support of the federal government when there's vision and there's thought behind it. I think when you talk about LA, both on the immigration front and the wildfires, which they like to conflate a lot, the new mayor of LA, Karen Bass, has done a great job in rallying her troops and pulling the city back together, along with the support of Governor Newsom. And so I don't think that the secretary is actually right about this. What we want to hear, what Democrats, Republicans, Independents want to hear is a plan. If you're going to go into these cities and go after people and do mass deportation, what is the plan? Who are you deporting? Why are you deporting them? And what's due process?
And Jeanette, let's bring you in to round out this discussion. Do you think what's happening in Los Angeles right now is a successful representation of the Trump administration's vision?
Well, I think Karen Bass, the mayor of LA, should be grateful for the administration's support. You saw the riots against the ICE agents in LA. There was nothing that the mayor wanted to do. She didn't bring in local police. So the National Guard was deployed by the president. Now, he was able to do that because he said, he was protecting federal assets. Whether or not he is able to deploy U.S. National Guard troops to other cities using that same maneuver, time will tell that, because he might have to invoke the Insurrection Act, which would be a much bigger decision on the president's part. But, I think that Mayor Bass, Gavin Newsom, who is looking to clearly score some political points, should welcome the cooperation of federal agents, not only with these riots that were out of control, but with the California wildfires when they do need assistance from the federal government. I think every mayor who's dealing with violent crime in their cities should want the support of President Trump. 80% of Americans 80% feel that violent crime is out of control in our cities. So this is something that an overwhelming majority of American people support.
Okay, a very fascinating conversation. We'll have to leave it there for today. Jeanette Hoffman and Hyma Moore, thanks to both of you for your time and your perspective.